Hello everyone at the Hebrides International Film Festival. It is lovely to be talking to you today. I'm Emily Penn. I'm an ocean advocate and a skipper, and also the co-founder of an organisation called eXXpedition. And I've spent the last 10 years sailing all over the world, looking at the challenges that are currently facing our ocean, and in particular the issue of plastic pollution. And my journey once began when I was on my way from England to Australia for a new job as an architect, which is what I had trained in. And I decided I wanted to get there without taking an aeroplane. And so I started looking at the map. 14,000 nautical miles between England and Australia. And I was looking for a boat to cross the Atlantic and the Pacific. And I came across this project called Earthrace, a boat that had just broken the round the world speed record, running on 100% biofuel. And they were about to go around the world for a second time to visit 120 cities to talk to schools, media, politicians about renewable energy. So I wrote to the skipper and I said, how do I get a job on board your boat? And they said, come to Brighton for the weekend and we'll see how you get on. So I showed up with enough stuff to last me a weekend and didn't end up going home for another 923 days. So this boat was my ticket to Australia. But what I didn't realise at the time is that it was going to trigger an entirely new career that I was never expecting to have. And we had the most amazing journey across the Atlantic. I learned to wakeboard. We went through the Panama Canal in a thunderstorm, and then we crossed the Pacific. We stopped at the Galapagos and visited tiny little Polynesian communities along the way. But there were so many things that I was never expecting to see on this trip around the world. And one of them was actually being woken in the night by the sound of something hitting the hull of our boat. And when we came up on deck, we found that we were surrounded by pieces of plastic. Now at this time, we were 800 miles from the nearest point of land. And in fact, the closest other human beings to us were actually in the space station in orbit above our heads. But yet there was this evidence of human life and waste in the most remote part of our planet. And most of all for me, it just didn't make any sense. Where was it coming from? How was it getting there? And really, what impact was it then having on the ocean and the marine life? We would then stop at small islands, and we found very different things there as well. They were struggling with commercial fishing that was emptying their waters, that meant they could no longer catch fish to feed their families. They couldn't grow food in the ground because the rising sea levels had caused their soil to become so salty that their crops wouldn't grow. And the knock-on effect of all of this pressure on their natural resources meant a new reliance on importing packaged food and drink that came from thousands of miles away, wrapped up in this new, strange material, plastic. And there was nowhere for that plastic to go, no waste management system, and really nothing to do with it other than to put it on the beach, to throw it in the ocean, or burn it. And it was that burning plastic smell that kept getting at my nose on all of these islands, and I started to learn, what is that smell that I'm smelling? And I learned about dioxins, chemicals that are released through incomplete combustion when you burn in a backyard setting rather than a proper incinerator, and how they're chemicals that can really impact our health. They lead to cancer and they disrupt our hormones. And they're really chemicals that we and the kids living on these little Pacific islands do not want inside our bodies. And so this became my first mission. I wanted to eliminate the burning of plastic on this small group of islands in the Pacific in the Kingdom of Tonga. So when I finished the project with Earthrace, instead of going to take that architecture job in Australia, I sailed back to these little islands that seemingly are absolute paradise. There's turquoise ocean and white sandy beaches, and even a breeding ground for humpback whales. But ultimately, down on the ground, it is a really challenging story, with the huge pressure of waste that's now both washing up on their shores and being created domestically, because there's not really any other option. And so I set about to learn more about the issue, and in particular what the mindset was of the local community. And interestingly, when I started to learn the Tongan language so that I could talk about the ocean and waste, I quickly found out that there wasn't actually a word for rubbish or bin, and that idea of throwing something away into a controlled system, it just didn't exist in their culture, because up until so recently it hadn't needed to. A banana peel or a coconut husk could happily be thrown on the ground without any consequence. So I started to realise that it wasn't just infrastructure that these communities needed, but actually a new way of thinking about this new inorganic material, plastic. And so I ended up spending 6 months working with the local government on a long-term system, and working with the schools and the community groups on understanding more about the importance of the health of our ocean and the challenges around plastic. And we culminated in the most enormous cleanup event, and together 3,000 people, which was 3/4 of the island population, came together, and we picked up 56 tons of rubbish in just 5 hours. Now, this amount of waste, it absolutely staggered me. It took us weeks to clean and sort and package that waste into 3,000 sacks to be taken away on a freighter ship, some to go and be recycled, and that couldn't to go to a safe landfill site. But this whole time on Tonga, it got me thinking about this question around convenience. This is what I was hearing of the reason why we use all of this single-use plastic in our everyday lives. And there I was, standing on an island in the middle of the Pacific with 56 tons of waste, thinking this is about the least convenient situation I could ever imagine. And so as I moved on with the next stage of my journey, I explored a lot more about where this plastic's coming from and why we're really using it in the first place. I started to learn some of the shocking statistics, the 60,000 plastic bags that we're using every 3 seconds, and how there's this material that is designed to last forever, but we go and use it for things like bags and bottles that are designed to be used just once and then thrown away. And how it's really this mismatch of material science and product design that puts us in this situation of having huge amounts of plastic waste that no longer has any use or any value. But then I thought, can't we just recycle all that plastic? Can't we just turn it back into new things? But it turns out that only 9% of the plastic that you and I use actually gets recycled. And that number is so low because plastic is actually a word that we give to hundreds of different materials. They all have different properties, stretchy or hard, clear or coloured, and therefore they need different chemical structures. But when we recycle something, we can only take one type of plastic at a time to get a good quality product out the other end. So there's this huge amount of waste that needs to be cleaned and sorted. And then you come across something like a toothbrush that's got 3 or 4 different types of plastic stuck together into one object, which makes it completely impossible to recycle. And so the reality is, at the moment, we're not actually designing our products for their end of life to be recycled. We're just designing them for the initial use, and as a result are creating a huge amount of waste. And a lot of that waste goes to landfill, but a surprising amount of it escapes, and it finds its way down streams, drains, rivers, where ultimately everything runs downhill to the ocean. When it gets to the ocean, I then started to learn about these ocean gyres that are driven by the currents around our planet, and how in the northern hemisphere we have these two huge clockwise rotation currents, where in the centre there's this very calm patch. The centre of the high, we would call it as a meteorologist, but as scientists looking at plastic, this is what we call a gyre. And there's actually 5 of them around the world, the other 3 being in the southern hemisphere. And now back then, when I was looking at this issue and this realization of these gyres theoretically appeared, it was only the North Pacific, the area between California and Hawaii, known as the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, that had been researched. And so I started looking at these other 4 hotspots on the map, thinking, I wonder what's going on in those parts of the world as well. So this became my next mission, to sail to those other 4 gyres and find out what's there, how much really is out there, and ultimately, what can we do to try and clean it up? And so we set sail, heading for these accumulation zones. And when we arrived at these coordinates, we started to see bits of plastic, a piece here, a piece there, maybe every 10 seconds passing the side of the boat. We got our nets out and we started fishing this plastic up on board. Everything you can imagine, from a cigarette lighter to a garden chair to a rugby player's gum shield. It was all floating around out there in the middle of, in this case, the South Atlantic. But by the end of the first day, in the centre of this accumulation zone, we looked at the pile that we had on the deck and we thought, this doesn't quite make sense, because there's 8 million tonnes of plastic going into our ocean every year. And here we are in the centre of the accumulation zone and we've got a pile, but it's not that much. Where was the rest of all of this plastic going? Now, it turned out it was there. We just hadn't seen it yet. And this plastic actually, once it gets into the marine environment, it fragments into tiny pieces from the wind, the waves, and the UV rays from the sun, into these fragments that we call microplastics. They're about the size of your little fingernail, and you can't see them when you look at the surface of the water. You can't see them by satellite image from space. But when you take a fine mesh net across the surface of the ocean and pull it up, you realise what's really there. Hundreds, thousands, what we now know to be trillions of microplastic fragments floating on the surface of the ocean. Now, the key here is, although they're breaking down and getting smaller, they're not biodegrading. They're not going back into that natural circle of life. They're simply getting smaller, harder to see, and much, much harder to clean up. So we now know that there's over 5 trillion fragments on the surface. What we don't know is how many times that have actually sunk to the depths. Because in our samples that we collect at sea, we're finding them in the water column, on the seabed, and really throughout our entire ecosystem. The fact that these pieces of plastic were so small, it opened a new series of questions for our research as well, because as we started catching fish, we found that they were actually mistaking these tiny fragments for food, the zooplankton that floats on the surface of the ocean as well. And so when we opened up these fish, there we found these plastic fragments. And we started to think about, could there be a chemical consequence of having this plastic getting into the food chain? Of course, the food chain that we are at the top of. And the reality is there's not a lot of evidence at the moment that can connect chemical transfer through the production of plastic and through adhering to plastic and moving up the food chain. And so a few years ago, I decided to just skip to the end of the chain, to me, and look inside my own body for some of these toxic pollutants that are used when we make plastic. We tested my body for 35 chemicals that are banned by the United Nations because of their toxicity. And of those 35 chemicals, we found 29 of them in my blood. Now, this really shocked me. And I think mostly because often when we're hearing about these environmental issues, usually it's something that we're reading on the news or seeing on TV that's happening somewhere else, that's impacting somebody else in the future. But this made me realise that actually already we all, I'm afraid, have a chemical footprint, something we will never get rid of. And at the moment, those levels of chemicals, they aren't alarmingly high that we need to be immediately concerned about our health, but it is a scary indicator of the direction that things are heading. Now, this test for me sparked a whole new project called eXXpedition, a series of all-female sailing voyages venturing to different parts of the globe to understand more about both plastic and toxic pollution. Because the more I understood about those 29 chemicals inside my body, I learned that most of them disrupt hormones. And particularly for us girls, during pregnancy, those hormones are absolutely vital so that we can have a healthy child. And we can also pass these chemicals on to our children when we give birth and when we breastfeed. And so I thought, why not tackle this female-centered issue with an amazing team of women? And so over the last 6 or 7 years, we've set off with a mix of nationalities and most importantly, a mix of skill sets of amazing women from around the world to find out more. Because I'm a big believer that actually there's not one silver bullet solution to solve the plastics issue. And what we really need are the hundreds of solutions that already exist, they're already out there, and we need to start putting them to use. But to do that, we need a mix of people. We need everyone from journalists to artists to teachers, designers, policymakers, and industry leaders, people who are able to go and understand the problem, communicate it, and then also put those solutions into action. So that's exactly what we do at eXXpedition. And most recently, we embarked on a mission to sail around the world with 300 multidisciplinary women to explore this issue. We made it from the UK as far as Tahiti before the pandemic kicked in and had to move our plans to a virtual way of finishing off the project for now. And at the same time, we built a platform online that you can find at www.shift.how. And it's a great platform to go and explore these hundreds of solutions that I'm talking about to the plastics issue, to find the one that you can get started on. Because ultimately, I like to think that we all have a superpower, and it's all different for whoever we are. There's something that we're brilliant at that makes us unique, and we need to look for where that superpower intersects the issue of plastic pollution or whatever else it is that you care about. And if you can find that sweet spot and then start taking action, then you're going to be able to maximize the impact that you can make. So please do go and check out shift.how to navigate all of these different solutions and find a place to start so that we can all be part of tackling this issue. Because ultimately, it's billions of micro actions that have caused this problem of plastic getting into the sea. But it is also micro actions from every one of us that is going to reverse it and allow us to solve the problem. So thank you so much for listening to this today and for being here, being part of this. And I wish you all great luck and hope that you have a fantastic festival and event. And hope that you also look to find your role in being able to tackle these issues that our ocean really needs us to do. Thanks a lot.